Welcome, everybody, to Big and Robot Presents Entertaining Guests. This week, we are going to be speaking with Chris Avellone, games writer, comics writer, designer. Is a designer, does that fit as well? Game designer?
It does. I do a good chunk of game design as well.
Oh, excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, yeah, thank you for coming on the show and joining us, sir. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Basically, on the podcast, we talk about comics, movies, video games. That's kind of our focus. So you're kind of the perfect person for this, Chris, because you encapsulate all those things. Well, maybe not movies. I don't know. Have you ever worked on film at all?
I tried to do the Legend of Grimrock movie script, but that didn't quite pan out. So so I tried it, but it's never actually reached the big screen.
Well, you still got time, I think. So, could be. Fingers crossed.
I certainly hope so.
Yeah. But you've definitely worked in comics and you've definitely worked in movies. Not movies. You've definitely worked in games. So you've definitely got those covered. And those tend to be our focus here. So, yeah, thanks for coming on and talking to us about this kind of stuff. So it's really good to have you. Yeah.
I guess I'll jump in with the first question. I think people usually know you as this guy who started with D&D, writes stories, narrative. I guess narrative designer is the title I see that you get a lot.
Yeah, there's a big debate in the communities about whether someone should be like a writer or a narrative designer. I usually use narrative designer just because it means you're sort of got your hands more deeply into the game scripting, the quest scripting, and then a lot of writers that I know. So I think that's why I usually make the differentiation.
Yeah, you're just not sitting there writing up ideas. You're getting in there and making sure that parts of it will work. But what would you say? Who would you say you really are? Like the media always has ideas of who someone is, but like growing up, were you maybe like an only child? Were you the oldest sibling? Were you maybe a bookworm or like cool jock? Or who are you? Who are you?
God, that's a very deep question. So I am the younger brother of grand total of two brothers, including me.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes any sense. My brother was a lot more extroverted than I was. He played in a band, heavy metal, death metal. He was very outgoing. I was not. I was very introverted. And it was that period of time when being a geek was not cool. So there was many... How do I put this? My damage threshold had to go up because of a great deal of beating up. Because, they just sense it when you're down the corridors. Like, aha, it's the nerd. And so the constant state of fear kept me on my toes. That was good. I think it heightened my perception skills. But then eventually, like after all the early school days, I actually went to this high school. It was sort of like a magnet school in Virginia. It was like the Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. And there I found myself among my own kind. And I also found that I was really dumb compared to them. So I got the reversal of what I'd been feeling before, which was actually very humbling and a good way to sort of like, check yourself. So that was good. But yeah, introverted, got tired of getting beaten up, and then I got used to feeling dumb. So yeah, that was pretty much who I am.
That explains why you're such a nice person.
I was gonna also chime in. Is like I was doing some prep work for this, and I was watching some videos of you doing some interviews and some things, some talks and things, and you look like you're a pretty buff guy now. Like so, I don't think you'd have much. I don't think you'd have much problem now. With the whole beating up thing.
Yeah, I used to have a better sort of work-life balance, but I think ever since going freelance, I think I'm enjoying work too much. And so I don't actually hit the gym nearly as much as I used to, but I'm happy. So that's the important thing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, okay, well, you kind of just blew through a bunch of our questions there as far as like your schooling and all that sort of stuff goes. What was your upbringing as far as like your family goes? Were either your parents into creative endeavors, or was it was your dad like the typical business guy and your mom was a homemaker kind of thing? Like what was your growing up period like, as far as like anything that might influence your creative process going forward, I guess?
My dad was an astronomer and a physicist, and he worked for the Pentagon. He never could.
Holy shit, that's cool.
Yeah, he could never quite tell us what he did, but, he'd come home and he said, I may not like my job, but at least I'll have 10 minutes of warning before the nuclear warheads hit. And then he would leave the room and I'd stare at the wall for a while. And then, and my mom was a substitute teacher, which actually is a deadlier profession that my dad was involved with. Substitute teachers really have to struggle. So she taught English classes, and she always made sure that my grammar was correct, and was good to me as a mom can be. I think when it came to parents, I was really blessed. Yeah, but no, home life was pretty stable, actually. I almost venture to say that it was almost stable enough to be boring, except when I went to school.
Right. Well, I mean, where you're from, if people don't know, the Northern Virginia area is commonly referred to as Nova, and it's kind of it's very much a very suburban type place, at least from like my experience with it anyway. Because I live in Richmond, I've lived here for quite some time, but it's kind of the same kind of dynamic. It's a very kind of boring place. It's like it's pretty low key, not a whole lot of craziness going on. So yeah, I get that. I understand that.
I remember the first time driving to Richmond and then seeing all the buildings that had been painted cigarette cartons, and I was amazed.
Oh yeah, out at Philip Morris. So, yeah, right in front of there, coming down 95. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, that place is crazy. Yeah. So I guess now that we know kind of your schooling and all that sort of stuff, what was the thing that got you into gaming in the first place? Like, what was your first experience with gaming? Was it just board games, or was it console gaming? Like, where did you start getting your foot in the door as far as that went?
Well, I'd always enjoyed Dungeons and Dragons, and when I first got exposed to it, I thought it was the most amazing idea ever. Wow, you can play make believe, but then it's fair because there's rules and chance, and not everything goes in your favor, but that affects the story and your experience. And I'd read all the modules for D&D and imagine myself going through the dungeons and oh yeah, I'd find that loot or I'd figure out that secret. It was like reading an interactive book, so that was fun to do. It was just hard to find people to actually play D&D with. I'd bother my mom, I'd bother my dad, I'd bother my brother. And eventually I got a few friends who were willing to play, even though they wouldn't GM. So we went through like Cults of the Reptile God and Temple of Elemental Evil, and then we graduated over to superheroes. I guess graduation is a loose verb to use. We had Champions and Super World, and then we had a Warhammer campaign. And then by that time I was sort of roughly around college, and I suddenly realized I had all these modules that I'd written, and it felt like a waste to throw them away. So I tried to submit them, and I got a number of laughable rejections back, and even editors that would say, "Hey, please stop sending us stuff." And some editors would even transfer me to their assistants as soon as they heard I was calling. So that was all fun. But then eventually, one of the companies that was doing the Champions game, the hero games, they did call me back because their editors switched, and they realized they needed to fill up one of their product lines, Dark Champions. So it was kind of like a Batman style Champions universe. So I wrote a character book for them, and then did more work for them, and then realized there's no money in pen and paper games. So I'm like, ooh, well, I can't survive on $50 every month or 2 months.
Right.
So I asked them, like, hey, well, I'd like to keep writing for you guys, but I can't support myself this way. Can you guys have any recommendations for places I could apply to? And it turns out one of the owners knew one of the studio directors at Interplay for their Dragonplay division, which is doing all their D&D titles. And he goes, you know what? I could recommend you. And I'm like, sure, that'd be great. I'd love a steady paycheck. And so we did. And then I learned later on that every time he referred somebody, he got $300 worth of software. So it was in his best interest to make those transactions happen. But, I got out there, got lost on my way to the interview. That was great. Came in wearing a suit. I think the studio director laughed at me and goes, hey, at least you weren't wearing a tie, because if you're wearing a tie, we'd cut it off. And then he said, well, let's see what your design experience is. And if you were to pitch us a Planescape game, what would you do? So I basically told him the summary. I thought what would eventually become Torment. And he's like, all right, yeah, you seem all right. So he hired me as a junior designer, and then things just went from there.
Wow. That's pretty impressive. So did you have any experience besides pen and paper, D&D type stuff, with console gaming, when you were younger at all?
No, not really. The only computer product I worked on before Interplay was this random.
Well, not worked
generator.
on, actually owned. You did, when you were a kid. Did you have any?
Oh yeah. I played a lot of not PC, more like Commodore 64 games and even TRS-80 games. So I played a lot of the original Bard's Tale 1, 2. Even though I thought 2 was bullshit. 2. Oh my God, that dungeon design in Bard's Tale 2 made me want to kill somebody. And then I thought Bard's Tale 3 was awesome. But yeah, Wasteland 1 I played, and I didn't have a lot of console games. My parents didn't really like the consoles, like the Atari system, so I had to settle for the Commodore 64. But I was more than happy with that. So I did a lot of computer gaming for RPGs on that system.
Okay, so then you had some basis as far as like early experience with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Right on. What was your favorite game growing up though? Like what was the thing that really kind of like it sticks with you to this day? You're like, man, I love that experience.
Wasteland 1, because of some design decisions they did towards the end of the game. Like they had this one great level where you go through a robot's brain and you use all your intellect stats to actually fight the monsters there. And I thought it was the most brilliant thing I'd played up to that point. I think Mike Stackpole designed it. And Chrono Trigger, that was generally every Japanese RPG was pretty much, I was like, wow, these stories are really good as opposed to the other things I was playing. First time playing Pool of Radiance was amazing. And then I already talked about Bard's Tale 1, 2, and 3. But basically Wasteland 1, Chrono Trigger. And I also like this SSI game called Eternal Dagger, which was sort of the sequel to Wizard's Crown. It had a lot of freedom and skill development, even though the story was kind of weak. But because it gave so much freedom and skill development, it felt like you were role-playing each character, and each character sort of had their personality or their thing. And that was kind of cool. And yeah, so that's just a few of them.
Nice.
So before we get too deep further into games, I want to say I noticed that you very much were a writer. I think that was your major. You were an English major, which I commend you. That's extremely brave. But I would warrant to guess that you did a lot of reading growing up. Were you a reader? Were there any books that were a favorite for you that really just like hit a chord with you and it just stays with you to this day?
Yeah, usually just about everything by Roger Zelazny. I thought it was amazing. I started with the Chronicles of Amber, and I thought that entire world layout that he developed was great. I read a lot of comic books, Alan Moore, and Garth Ennis, and Frank Miller, and all those definitely had an impact. Like everything, Dark Knight Returns to the original Watchmen, and the entire Preacher series. I thought was pretty damn cool. But yeah, well, time before Netflix, so getting movies wasn't really easy. So usually it was a lot of reading and comic book reading. But I had a blast.
Oh wait, you know what? We grew up in the same area and we're the same age. Do you remember? Was there an Errol's near you? And do you remember that at all? The video rental place?
Oh my God, yes, I do, man. Day that opened up, I had to make the choice between getting the beta. What was the other system?
The Betamax or the VHS? Yeah.
Oh yeah. We're like, we're gonna go with the VHS, and then every trip to that store was like a gold mine. Yeah. We're like, well, look at the movies. This is amazing. Oh my technology. Wow.
Oh, that's so great that we're regional. We grew up in the same region, so that you actually know what that is. That's so wonderful.
It takes me back.
All right.
Maybe in 2 universes over, you guys actually became friends because you were so close by.
Well, you said your brother. How old's your brother? And he was playing death metal bands and metal bands and stuff?
Uh-oh, here we go.
Yeah.
It's happening.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure he's older, 3 years older, 48, I think.
Okay.
Maybe 49. I actually forget how old I am sometimes. I'm that out of touch with myself.
Right.
Don't worry, I do the same thing too.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Same. Yeah, because it's pretty possible that if he played bands, if he was in a band in Northern Virginia, and he played shows, it's pretty possible that I've been to one of his shows, because I was really big in the hardcore and the punk and the metal scene back in the day, and I used to go to shows constantly up in Woodbridge and all around in there and up in DC and so yeah, who knows.
You ever heard of a band called Medusa?
Well, I would like to say yes, but it could just be Medusa's a fairly popular name, and I could be tricking myself.
that was kind of my thought too. But he played. I don't know if they had a lot of gigs, so I wouldn't be surprised. But he certainly had fun doing those sort of off and on. So that was kind of cool.
Right on.
Myself and some friends play D&D game. We're crazy enough to start producing our own. And unfortunately, I didn't know a whole lot about D&D other than that, oh crap, I really like this thing. I really like this playing pretend. And then, playing a character. It's like a video game, but you can be even more expressive. So I had to go and learn quite a bit. But to me, the strangest thing was the idea. I mean, I went and later asked my friend who GMs a lot of games. He said it was called a supplemental, which I guess is what you were doing. And to me, that was the craziest idea that I had read, that you were able to at least get some, a little bit, you said $50 a month. The idea that you could write a campaign and then get paid for that. And it just blew me away that happened. It's I didn't really have a question there. I just wanted to share that.
It's still surprising me to this day. They'll people will pay for computer game writing or computer game design. I thought people just did that for fun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess if I can make this a little more meaningful for our listeners, Well, what advice would you give someone if they thought $50 a month to write D&D stuff sounds great? Like, what would you tell them other than make sure you have something else to pay bills?
Well, that piece of advice is absolutely solid. I'd also remind them that it's a lot of work. So if you don't naturally do it, and I was naturally doing it, the thought of getting paid didn't occur to me. I was just trying to entertain my friends and keep a campaign going before it occurred to me it might be a colossal waste of time unless I did something else with it. Don't ever get into game design or game writing for the money. If that's kind of the goal of why you should just be doing it or any job because you love it and because you're going to spend so many of your hours of your life doing it. And getting the job you love, I have to say I don't have hobbies because my work is my hobby, and that's it definitely keeps me going from week to week. Like, it's never a dull moment, and get to just create and create and create. And it's I'm so glad I ended up pursuing this, and I wasn't like a banker or teacher or even an architect. I'm like, those things wouldn't have made me as happy as I am today.
What about astronomer for CIA?
Yeah, there you go.
Ooh. No, that would definitely inform some of my superhero modules. I'm like, okay, now I know how the CIA works. I can make adventures forever now based on things that only I know.
Well, and that brings up an interesting thing, though. You actually did a minor in architecture at one point when you were in college?
Yeah, that was a big turning point. I'd gotten accepted to 2 colleges in Virginia. One was Virginia Tech, and the other one was William and Mary. And I was, for some reason, I forget why, I think it's because I enjoyed drawing dungeon maps, that I thought that I would enjoy being an architect.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I was like, okay, well, William and Mary doesn't really have an architecture program, so I will go to Virginia Tech. But the nice thing was William and Mary said that they liked the application so much that if I changed my mind in 2 years, they would automatically accept me. So I was like, okay, well, that's really nice. So then I went to Virginia Tech. I got a lot of architecture experience and drawing experience, and get to experience like part of the program at Virginia Tech is for the first year they just give you a whole bunch of different media tools like markers or paints or drafting boards, and they teach you just how to sort of like draw outside the boundaries and think creatively before they start layering rules on top of that. So that was a really good experience for when I got to computer games, because then I knew more about how to storyboard, how to draft out an isometric level, because architecture had trained me to do that. So it also trained me to work really hard, as if the Thomas Jefferson High School wasn't enough. Architecture lab was falling up 80 or 90 hours a week, but which I got used to, which also helped with game development, because that was the kind of hours that we kind of had to pull at Interplay sometimes to get a game done, and for long periods of time. So it was good I got that aspect of architecture training down. But at the end of the second year, my professor was going through my sketchbook, and he's like, Chris, you're kind of filling the sketchbook up more with words than you are with actual sketches. I like your sketches, but I think you may want to do something else. And I'm like, okay, well, I thought about it. And then he gave another lecture not long after to the whole architecture class that, hey, if you really don't want to be an architect, you should change your life right now. And I thought he was talking to me, but he's probably talking to a bunch of people in the room who didn't seem that focused on architecture. So I called my parents and I'm like, look, I think I'm ready to make a college change. And they said, oh, we knew it. And I'm like, what?
Really?
And they're like, yeah, we knew, it seemed like William and Mary resonated more with you. And we know you want to write. And so if you want to try the English program there, we'll absolutely support you. And I'm like, oh my God, my parents are empathic. Oh my God, they're so wonderful. And then in the next 3 years, I got my English major, and I confess I had really no idea what to do with it other than I just enjoyed it. So I figured that if I kept working at something would pan out, and it did.
Oh wow, that's pretty cool, man. That's pretty excellent that you have a really good relationship with your folks, and they kind of already keyed into it. That's pretty. I don't know how common that is. It definitely wasn't common with me per se, but yeah, no, that's great that you had that kind of relationship with them. That's excellent.
Yeah, my parents were great. Yeah, they were fantastic. I do have to tell you guys about one other job that I had though before getting into game design. And
Yeah.
Weirdly enough, it was a role-playing job that one of my friends who was studying theater told me about. And he's like, hey, I've signed up with this program that allows you to role-play criminals in police and FBI training exercises. And I'm like, well, that sounds kind of interesting,
Really?
yet dangerous.
That sounds fun as hell, actually. Wow.
Yeah, it's really where you simulate you just got into an accident with another person, and the police trainees show up to sort of walk through the steps of how to question the people about the accident and get all the right information, but the best ones were the FBI ones, because what they would do is they actually built this fake city, not city, but fake town town outside of Quantico Marine Base where they train the FBI agents. And this little fake town has like, a little pool hall, like a lot of residences, trailer park. And you're given this casting sheet like, hey, you're the guy that stole like 4 crates of blank videotapes from the warehouse. And now the police are, so now the FBI are tracking you down, hide in this certain section of the house and, act this way if they confront you or, and the roles range from like being kidnapper to kidnappee, that was a great experience. You didn't get a lot of work from it, but the little work you did get paid well. And it was a lot of fun just to do. And the idea that they built out that environment just for training was just really, really cool.
Yeah.
That sounds like a less lame version. No, it sounds cool, but it sounds like it doesn't have any of the lameness of like a colonial reenactment person who like sits in the town and is like, I sew all my own clothes. I make the butter. It's like, I'm a criminal. I kidnapped this person and stuffed their body in a meat locker.
You'll never catch me, copper.
Yeah. You know what's funny though, Mark, is that that's actually a pretty big thing around here because Williamsburg is real nearby too. So the reenactors and all that sort of thing. Oh my gosh, yeah, it's pretty silly.
Oh no, I would totally want to do what you just mentioned, Chris. Like that sounds actually fun. Yeah. I mean, so how many times did you end up doing that?
I was actually there for about 3 or 4 years. The work was pretty inconsistent. Like you might go like once or twice a week, but it was nice supplemental income. The actual FBI town was named Hogan's Alley, I think it was called, and they actually featured it a little bit at the beginning of the Silence of the Lambs movie, which was kind of cool. But yeah, it wasn't a ton of work, but it was a lot of fun. I will say my boss was very nice, and she goes, "Well, Chris, you're very reliable, but I have to say sometimes it's really hard to make you scary because you just don't seem very intimidating." And I'm like, well, that is both kind and sad. I don't think I'm destined for this role long term, which is probably good because I don't think I really wanted to be a criminal. So that's good.
Right. Well, pretend criminal. Right. So before we move on, just because this idea you've told me has blown me away, and I'm like anxious to hear more. So did you live in that fake town, or did you just like show up like it was a job and you would just sit around and wait for the trainees to come and then act out the character?
Yeah, it'd be so I'd drive there. It was kind of a lengthy drive, and then they would take us to a waiting room. We'd usually wait there for like 30 minutes to an hour. We'd get our casting sheets. Mm-hmm. Then we'd go to the sort of stage area where the training exercise is supposed to play out, whether you go to your trailer or whether you go to the card game you're supposed to be part of when the FBI trainees, like, they break in, they're trying to figure out which of the 4 of you is the right suspect. And or the pool hall or whatever it is. And then you're given a series of steps for how you're supposed to act when they approach you and how you can try and outmaneuver them if they allow for that.
Were you ever the dastardly criminal?
Well, during the kidnapping scenario, I was pretty proud of myself because I gave them all the slip and I bolted for it, escaped, and that did not go over well with the instructor. Not towards me, but towards the trainees, and he was pissed. He's like, "Wow, he really let them have it," and I felt bad for them, but I also felt really like I gotten away with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hell, how's he going to learn if he doesn't screw up every now and again, too?
Right.
So there's that. So you're doing him a favor in the long term, or in the short term, for the long term.
Exactly.
There you go.
And it's better they mess up with you than an actual criminal who kidnaps someone.
Right.
Absolutely. I agree.
Well, congratulations on your wily escape, sir.
They'll never catch me.
Oh man, that's so much fun. I want to talk about this for an hour now.
Right?
This is so interesting.
That sounds like something that would be fun to do for like a summer.
Yeah, for real. Oh my gosh, no, that's great.
The police ones. The police ones were a little more dull. It would be the car accident stuff. But sometimes you'd get really crazy ones, like police are asked to report to a school because they've seen someone hanging around or loitering, and your approach in that scenario was to take cover somewhere, and then when the cops show up, burst out and take some shots at them. And then the objective of that was to see how they would react when something like that happened. Like, were they prepared? Were they ready? Like, were they paying attention to the environment? But the fact that you could do that, and you could point even a fake gun at cops and fire away, that was pretty thrilling.
That sounds like a blast. That really does. Oh my gosh, you've had a pretty interesting life as far as your work experience goes.
It's been fun.
Wow, that is so cool.
Yeah, I'm pretty jealous.
To bring it down to a less fun question or interesting question, but still part of a necessity of the interview nonetheless. What is the process of writing a video game like? I mean, how similar is it to writing comics or say or writing other types of books? I mean, is there a system in place that is fairly rigid, or I mean, like, how does that work exactly? Give us an idea for anybody that maybe want to get into this kind of thing. Like, what can they expect from it?
Well, I think writers have different approaches. The way I like to approach it is when getting onto a game, I first of all want to get a sense for what the core pillars of the game are. Like, what are like the three big things that define this game? Like, is it a survival horror experience? Like, in other pillars, you have no weapons. Like, it's all, scare thrills, whatever happens to be, or like it's a full-on survival game. It's super realistic, and that's kind of the point of it. And then once you have those pillars, then what I like to do next is, I haven't done any writing yet.
Okay.
The next thing I do is, assuming it's not a franchise, which, with franchises, you immediately have to start absorbing everything you can about that franchise. But if it's not a franchise, or while you're absorbing franchise material, the next step I like to do is grab any existing design documentation, especially systems design, and read through what the gameplay from moment to moment is supposed to be like. Like, what's the player doing every second? Like, what's the activity that they're supposed to be enjoying? And then once I've absorbed that, I've asked all the questions that I need to for things like parameters for like how long the game's supposed to be, what engine might be being used, what the editor is, what's your dialogue tools, how are you envisioning the story being presented, like, what interface screens, or is it based on some other game that already has a presentation methodology that you have to follow? Like, for example, if we're doing like Fallout New Vegas, like, it's pretty clear we're going to have to present dialogues and the environment, pretty much like Fallout 3. Like, we can change the words and the actors, obviously, in the story setting, but the presentation is going to be largely the same. So that knowing that stuff is important when writing the story too. But then you sit down, you write, you go, okay, well, now that I know all the pillars of the game, I'm familiar with the franchise, I know all the systems. At that point, what kind of story can I write that will support that type of gameplay? And how can I complement the systems that are being used, the weapon design? And I usually try and start with a one-pager that just hits the major beats. And it usually has like a one sentence where I'm like, what would one player tell another player about this game and why it's cool? Like, is it BioShock with dinosaurs? Like, what's the one sentence that's going to communicate the gist of this game and why someone would want to play it? Like, that's the thing. And then you take that one pager, you run it by all the leads. And you're like, even lead animator, lead artist, all the stakeholders in the game. Get their questions, get their approval, get their sign off, and that's important because when their team members ask them about the story, they can speak to it and then say why they're in favor of it because they've already asked all the questions they need and you've hopefully settled any doubts they have. And then you just start iterating on that story. So you take the one pager and you're like, okay, well, now 4 pages. Like, let's detail out more of the areas where we think the theme of the story would, be conveyed, or the arc of the story, or, some scary locations for a survival horror game. Like, and what are the major characters? Like, what's the bestiary going to be like? What sort of, inhabitants of the environment will also help support the story. And then you take that, you keep expanding it, you start breaking it down into region design docs or level design docs. You also start doing character bios for things like, okay, well, here's the main antagonist, here's backstory, here's how he's introduced to the game, here's the pacing of it, here's any allies he has. And you just keep building that lore of the characters and the story and just increasing detail until you start writing quests and dialogue. And you keep doing that until it hits the QA phase.
Okay. Well, so then you don't already start out with it's like necessarily like we have to get to this point, so we're gonna have this many quests, and we have to necessitate, it has to be like as far as the franchise, like, well, people have an expectation of the last game did this, so we have to iterate on that and do this many things. So that's not really even like when you're starting out, that's not really even a concern.
Actually, well, no, that's a good point. It is. So with the pillars, I guess I probably should add that any parameters that the game has should also be kept in mind. So so for Fallout New Vegas, there's some pretty clear parameters that were laid out at the outset. First off, it's it's going to use the Fallout 3 engine. Like there's no debate on that.
Right.
Also, obviously set in the Fallout universe, and that's all the principles of that guide Fallout. Like, hey, there's 3 archetypes you can play. The gameplay should support all those archetypes. It should have that Fallout 1950s, imagining the future vibe, as well as the post-apocalyptic vibe. Also, our game had to be on the western half of the U.S. and should feature a signature city, just like Fallout 3 did with Washington, D.C. So, Vegas was pretty much a prime contender for that. So parameters like that are also part of your story design and inform your decisions too.
How would you say your tabletop game experience translates to game design? I mean, I've gotten a feeling of how your experience with tabletop games and writing narratives overlaps with this. How would you say how they differ? Like, I mean, in both cases, you have to sort of anticipate, choices a player might make, and then make sure that the story stays engaging. How would you say they overlap and how they contrast?
Well, contrast is probably the easiest thing to talk about first. So first off, the amount of detail that you have to do for a computer game is far exceeds what you have to do for a pen and paper game, where you can improv based on what the players want to do at any given moment. For like designing a quote unquote level for a pen and paper game can be much more vague about certain specifics. But a game design of a town, like, if you take, Good Springs from New Vegas, you have to know the names of all the key inhabitants. You have to know all their inventory items. You have to set all their skill levels. You have to know what happens when any of them die. You have to lay out the quests very, very specifically in terms of what the stages are. You have to account for every possibility a player can do in that quest. Because you aren't there running the game. Like you have to ensure the scripting and the code will take care of all those situations. And then everybody's like day and night routines, the most like the specific layout, the specific items the merchant has, like all of these things require sort of an excruciating amount of detail compared to pen and paper. Now, similarities is, I think, one thing that pen and paper gaming was really good for training me on was the importance of just realizing that every player wants to feel special, and they want to feel special in how they built their character. So if they did make that thief character, that's sort of the power fantasy they want. They want to be, the crafty guy. They want to be able to sneak around. They want to ambush people. Are you designing quests or scenarios that allow that one person to have their shining moments where they're really cool because they've developed the character that way? And we had to do this when we were doing Fallout Van Buren back at Interplay, and Van Buren was kind of like the code name for Interplay's attempt to do Fallout 3, which didn't really pan out. But we actually did a pen and paper game for Van Buren, and there was 2 different pen and paper groups testing out the levels and the quests they were planning to include in the game. And the most fun challenge of it was these were 12 different characters. Like you had to design something cool for the Xboxer from New Reno, along with the super mutant Nightkin, who's a master of stealth. And you had to make every quest and area have something cool for those characters to do and some viable way for them to go through it. And that was a really fun challenge. Also, a lot of the stuff that you do for laying out pen and paper game sessions, like drawing maps and setting up loot tables, all of that stuff pretty much translates into pre-work you have to do for level design in computer games as well, gathering reference art, getting snapshots of an area so you can show them to the players. All those things you'll find that you end up doing again for computer games. So usually presenting it to a team member and going, hey, here's what I sort of imagine this inventory item looking like, or here's some reference art for the level that I thought was cool, or for the bunker door, or how the this particular character looks like, this photo I dragged off the net, and like all those things like sort of become part of your arsenal.
You were kind of, once again, you at the start you hit a lot of our questions without us even asking it.
Right.
But what would be?
That was very rude of me.
No. Hey, man. We'll take it as any way you want to give it.
Yeah,
like
same.
if as long as it gets us to the finish line. But it sounded like you were explaining that it's a lot more involved than I think people would anticipate for a narrative designer. Like it sounded like there was some crunchy aspects. If you could just touch briefly on that.
Yeah. So sometimes writers want to get into the game industry because they feel that writers have a lot of power there and they can tell their story. And one cautionary tale I always share with them is that usually when you get onto a project, you will be writing for someone else or you'll be writing for a franchise, and the story will not belong to you. In fact, you can be a torch holder for it, but often someone else will have the authority on that story. And also, you really need to take a step back from your own work sometimes, because you have to realize when you're writing for a game, it has to be the player's story too, and you have to give them freedom to actually interact with it, because that's where the best moments, I think, actually come with stories. It's not what some NPC of the talking head is, telling the player. It's going to be what the player's actually doing in the environment, or that near-death experience, they went through, killing 20 orcs in a narrow corridor with only a hammer. Like stuff like that is stuff that you can't really write. And I mean, you could, but it's much more of a passive experience for the player to absorb something like that versus something they're actually doing, and that actually makes their story. So making sure that writers know that they should let the player have some freedom in what they do, and they shouldn't hold every word or scene sacred, like, oh, the player has to experience this or else my magnum opus won't be fully realized. I always say no to that. I'm like, nope, you got it. I don't agree. I think you should let the player find those beautiful moments on their own, because they probably have a different outlook on life than you do, and they see different things as being special. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't throw those things in if you want to, but don't mandate the player has to experience each one of those. That's kind of claustrophobic and confining. Also, for the more crunchy aspects, you really have to know just about, a ton of stuff about Word, ton of stuff about Excel, like you're going to be doing a lot of work in spreadsheets, believe it or not. Excel's kind of like the final destination for almost all the writing in a computer game. So, then they have to have that, because they have to track localization and line translations, and then export it for the studio, and then have the recordings take place there. Make sure that everything is really carefully tracked, because if you miss a line or two, or if a file name gets messed up, that can really really be a lurking landmine in your computer game that some player's going to find. So there's that. And then practicing your technical writing. You're going to be doing a lot of emails, but more importantly, you're not only going to have to write dialogue and write quest and story, but you're going to have to organize that information too. Like you're going to have spreadsheets for the quests. You're going to have to indicate the specific stages, suggested rewards for each stage of the quest. Usually you'll have to be doing your own information tracking. Like you'll have to have knowledge of, how to name variables, how to set variables, when to set variables. Have you accounted for every single way a player might attack a quest? Like, is there a way they may have completed the quest before they even talk to the quest giver? And all of those things just come from a misery of mistakes that I've made over the past 20 years. But I'm happy to share those things. But yeah, there are a lot of crunchy bits to game writing, and it's not always the dream of sitting down and I'm going to write my own favorite character today. No, usually it's a lot of surrounding work to actually make that character realized properly in a computer game.
You said when you talked about potential landmines, I heard a chuckle. I'm pretty sure is there a story there, Chris?
Not one that I remember.
You just recall the agony of being in those situations.
Yeah. You have that lingering pain in the back of your brain still. It's like,
this is a related topic, but sometimes we would have the misfortune on various projects to get assigned a script doctor, and I don't mind a script doctor per se when they're actually helpful. But the problem is a lot of them wouldn't know how to work an Excel file. So what would happen is, in one particular case, I think it was like Star Wars Knights of the Republic 2, we had a scriptwriter come in, mostly because I got the impression that they didn't have anything for him to do at LucasArts, so we got him, and he was helpful for some of the lines. But the problem was at some point a cell got deleted or a row got deleted, and everything, all the numbering was thrown off. So when the import happened, it actually messed up all the dialogue in the game. And these are the things that you have to be careful. Even when you get like Excel sheets back from the translator, you have to watch out for this. So overall, like there were some things that, you know, he was helpful about for like condensing certain lines or, you know, certain tone aspects. But overall, it actually would have saved us time if that hadn't been part of the process, just because it's so easy to mess something up like that if you don't, you know, if you aren't careful.
So basically what you're saying is he came in and deleted System 32 and kind of fucked everything up.
Suddenly, having every line offset by one created some really strange conversations. Let me tell you.
Oh, man. Oh, that's great.
It's like when you have closed caption on your TV and it gets thrown off,
Right.
and it just looks bizarre. Yeah.
You're like, what the hell is going on now?
Okay, so I think I know how I do it. You know, going in and building a world for a story. I mean, I've yet to build them for a game. But how do you start to do it? Like, not necessarily in terms of games, because you've explained the pillars. But how do you, you know, whether it be for your own entertainment or for D&D, how do you build a world?
Well, I start off with the genre or whatever rule system I'm going to use, because usually I don't make up my own rule system for a game. I use that as a tool for telling the story, and it was either like, you know, D&D or Hero Games or whatever, and so I figured that out. You know, maybe the best way to approach it is like, so when I was working on the New Vegas DLCs, we had that question of how to build the first DLC in the series, which was Dead Money, which sort of had a mixed reception, and you can blame me for that.
Actually, hold on. Let me interrupt you real fast, Chris. So for those of you who don't know, I interviewed Chris some years back about New Vegas. So whenever he brings up New Vegas, like a small part of my brain is lighting up, and like I want to start cheering. And even though I know people didn't like Dead Money, I loved the hell out of it, and I was such a dweeb that I started to like role play my not in real life, but in the game. I started to build a persona for my character, and I started to roleplay it. And I think I even told you this when I interviewed you back then. My character became like a giant Veracruz fanboy in playing the DLC. So when I met was Dean Domino, was that his name?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my character murdered the hell out of him. So, but I'm sorry, I just wanted to share that because you keep mentioning. I'm like, I have to tell them. But all right, go on, Chief.
Yeah, so when we were building the sort of parameters for that and constructing the quote unquote world, even though, you know, it's a DLC, we started breaking down what we wanted to see from that world. So the first thing was, hey, you know, we don't have a lot of resources for these DLCs, so a lot of the changes or the, you know, evolution or improvements, all of those sort of have to come through the environment and ambience. And also, you know, is there any way those environments can help solve technical issues for us? So we knew that mostly because I've always wanted to do one. I wanted to do like, I thought survival horror would be cool. Like I want sort of a more survival experience for Fallout, because people like would, you know, stockpile stim packs, and it would make combat not very easy, and you'd forget about crafting stuff that would help you survive because you just didn't need it and you didn't care. But then for Dead Money, I'm like, you know what? Well, now let's, you know, make the crafting system more important. Like, let's make stim packs more valuable again. Let's make the player feel like they really have to fight for, you know, every inch of ground in that DLC. So that's kind of the survival experience. And then, okay, well, what would create, you know, a sense of horror in this location? Well, the first thing you do is you start obscuring line of sight whenever possible. So we had a lot of the toxic clouds around the city, which served to not always give you a sense for where every enemy was, but also helped prevent this issue that we had in New Vegas where a lot of the levels just got built too big with too many assets. So as soon as you saw one, like, it would slow the entire game down. So for Dead Money, we're like, you know what? We are going to build a lot of structures that block line of sight. So we're going to have this like enclosed town that you go through and the casino. But we'll also have these toxic clouds that also surround the city and also limit, you know, the amount of view the player can see. And that will also help on the technical side for us to create this environment. So it could serve a dual purpose. And then we're like, okay, well, now we get the bestiary. Like we want, you know, we think that there's a certain zombie type we might want to use to inspire terror, not just with, their appearance, their behavior, and their sound effects, but also how you fight them. And we're like, hey, well, let's switch their fighting style. So you have to figure out how to kill them, because reducing the 0 hit points doesn't always work. And then we're like, but even with that, like, combat characters are not going to be scared by these guys. So what would scare a player? And this was a mistake, by the way. This was not a positive learning experience.
Right.
For us, it was like, you know what? Well, we'll have these collars on the people's necks that were, in the core game. And what they would do is they'd be set off by things in the environment. So what would happen is you'd get to an area and then your collar would beep. And immediately, like, people up on the Let's Plays, they immediately rush backwards because they don't want their head to blow off. But these signals would actually cause, the bomb collar to blow your head off. So the trick was to approach one of these dangerous areas, which you usually had to get through, figure out where that stupid beeping was coming from and disable. But finding it was really difficult. And we saw that give people a lot of adrenaline rushes and also a lot of anger and rage quit, because, it was basically insta-death, even though we were trying to play fair. But some of the placements for those detonators was really tricky. And we had a lot of fun with, like, the visual storytelling for other prisoners who had been in this town who had actually tried to find the detonator and it failed. So they would have like ladders up against walls. And
I remember that part.
Yeah. So the little visual storytelling moments like that were part of the design. And then we're like, well, a casino heist would be cool, so let's make that a figurehead for the experience. What sort of elements have we foreshadowed in the core game that we can start developing along the DLC path? So we're like, we can include hints of Ulysses, like we can include references to seemingly innocuous props in the core game, like, the Dean Domino poster. We're like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if Dean Domino was still around? So we put him in the DLC to sort of like create connections there. And then we also knew we didn't have a lot of resources, like or especially time. We're like, we have to get this right and get it right quickly. So we're like, you know what? It would be in our best interest to control the scope of this DLC. So let's do something similar to what Fallout 3 did with the Pit and make it a series of levels that you go through rather than a full open world environment, because full open world takes a lot of time, creates a lot of bugs, and we had a really tight deadline. So we're like, okay, let's manage our scope and expectations and to make sure we can get this done. So that was part of the reason we had this enclosed villa and the enclosed casino, is because we're like, you know what, we don't want the player to stray too far off the range. But the problem with that, of course, is that that's sort of anti-Fallout. So that was an issue too. But all these factors are things that you think about when you're sort of constructing the lore and the story before you even get to the juicy bits, like, who the characters are, like what's their motivation for being there, how do they reinforce the theme, like, is there any way that they can help you reach your objective, why are they there, who's the antagonist, have we foreshadowed him enough, like does his reasons make sense, all this stuff just sort of ends up being like the skeleton that you start fleshing out and making the end result.
Wow. That was very thorough. I appreciate that, sir. Thank you. Yeah.
So, okay, I have a QA background. So I know when you were talking about, Excel spreadsheets and all that, I'm like, I had the flashbacks sitting there 3 a.m. and the next, the other shift, it just, well, anyway, I don't need to share my war stories. But I was good at QA because I like breaking games. Like, once I've played, if I really like the game and I played the hell out of it, I'm like, well, time to go break it. Let's see if I can now break this mission. To the point where it's like this would have been a showstopper and they would have had to like send this back to the dev team, who'd be furious that some shithead tester went and broke the mission and now they have to spend more time to fix it.
Yep.
But in a past D&D game, I played a particularly paranoid character and I was constantly trying to subvert my GM, and I'm pretty sure he hated it. Like it was going to go to the point where my character was starting to become worried that the gods were controlling him and that they were directly influencing what happened, i.e. he unwittingly knew that there was a GM. But the game ended up stopping before there. But I wanted to ask you, was there ever a time, whether it be with D&D or a game, where you were completely thrown off by a player's choice and it just like trashed what you had designed or planned out?
Yeah, we were doing the Fallout pen and paper game. Someone scored a critical hit out of the blue on one of who I envisioned to be one of the few primary antagonists, and killed him
Oh no!
arguably at the first 10% of the game. And
Oh
I
god!
floored. However, then I saw the reactions of people around the table, and they were happy and laughing and cheering. And it occurred to me that that's the story. It's a cool story now. Like they can say, guess what I did? Like
Right.
he's trying to be some kind of badass and he's doing all this shit and talking down to us. And you know what? I blew that sucker's head off. He didn't see that coming. And
Right.
I sure did. And then what I initially thought, in my mind, I saw all these dominoes falling for all this work that was wasted. But then I'm like, well, it's just a different story now. And actually, it's exciting to see how that will play out now. Like, what will the absence of that guy do? Like, what will killing him early mean? And then I'm like, and then it got really interesting where I'm like, well, this is what a role playing game's about. It's like reacting to things like that happen from the players. And can you still draw an interesting story from it? And often you absolutely can. It actually becomes an even better story because now that person had a dramatic change in it that now you can account for. And that's part of what makes Fallout great. Like, it's that kind of RPG.
And that actually leads perfectly into what I was going to ask you next was the way you're describing what you're doing as far as the writing process goes, it seems that I guess the term, you're more of a story facilitator than almost anything else, because like you said, you don't want to create the story and tell the person how they have to play it. You want to present these things, and I mean, not concretely, but you want to present it and let the player kind of figure it out and do those kind of things. So it's kind of like you're a story facilitator to a certain degree. I mean, does that sound about right? I mean, is there any truth to that at all, or am I just up my own ass right now?
Actually, no, that's a fair way to approach it. Like when writing for open world games, that is a lot of the approach. Like, what are you allowing the player to do in the environment? And I sort of see my responsibility with an open world game to be create a really interesting world to explore. The world has a history. It had a future it's heading towards, but ultimately it's a player's playground. And in terms of story, I mean, you can't have a single player story that goes across open world. I think those tend not to work. In all honesty, I think that ends up being distracting from what players really want to do in an open world game. So what I like to do instead is have the people you meet have their own individual stories that you can interact with if you want. Like, okay, you might meet someone who's interesting or a companion that's interesting, and you might choose to engage with them, but they're not the ones that are telling you to go from point A to point B to point C in a linear path. They're just elements that you can engage with that will, teach you more about the world or provide an interesting experience. But ultimately, you're the one driving the truck. So right. That's kind of my approach to it.
Okay. Well, then I guess, and then again, this is kind of along the same kind of lines because of what you've been talking about as far as the writing process goes. Do you do this? Is this all you, or do you have a group of people that you work with, or a writing partner specifically that you work with? Because this seems like a monumental task. I mean, this seems like a lot of work.
It depends. Sometimes it is just me,
really?
And other times you'll have the good fortune to have gameplay scripters who can help you set up certain interactions in the environment, or usually you're working with a great set of level artists and environmental artists too, who can help you arrange the props in an environment to tell a story, who get the graffiti you need to tell a story without any words, get beyond the actual symbols on the walls. Work with the animators, because the animation will tell you a lot about a character you're talking to, or even how they fight tells you a lot about the world and the story. When it comes to the actual writing, I've worked on games with large writing teams. Divinity Original Sin 2 has a large number of writers, and we bounce ideas back and forth either through Google Docs or through the occasional Skype call. And that's a great way to develop a story, and then allow, because usually each of them does a companion or a backstory, and so they take the communal story and then they have a companion that sort of provides their perspective on that world or addresses an element in that world they're really excited about. So having a team like that I think creates a much richer world than just one tone throughout. And then back at Black Isle, back at Interplay, we had the good fortune that a lot of our level designers were actually good writers, so they were able to do the job of level design and writing at the same time. So that was a positive thing. So the number of people you're working with can be large, it can be small. Like, say nothing of the audio department, and voice actors and voice directing, like all of that stuff comes into play with the story. And I don't think any one thing trumps another. Like, in some cases, it feels like the writing's the least important part. Like, there's just so much more that goes into it that's as important, if not more important, that it ends up being it sort of has to be a collaborative effort.
Okay. Well, I guess this is totally unrelated, the next question, but it's something I was kind of curious about. Is there ever a component of the Hollywood system, or the quote unquote Hollywood system, when you're doing a game where you've got to deal with things like focus groups, or you have people higher up in the chain that kind of look at what you're doing and be like, oh no, we got to change this, we got to do that, and it's kind of like, and to put it in kind of blunt terms, that it kind of chaps your ass because you feel like they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. I mean, does that ever happen when you're working on a game? Like, is that ever an experience that you've had personally?
Yeah, it does happen. So the focus groups are actually a very good thing, because sometimes you can be too close to your own game,
Right.
that you don't see some obvious flaws with it. And
Right.
like when I was working on Planescape Torment, like we didn't realize that people might miss the first companion Mort in the game right at the outset because he's really small. But watching all these people play the game and seeing a great many of them forget to grab him, find him, or add him to the party was immediately a big problem that we probably wouldn't have expected because we were too familiar with the game.
Okay.
The only tough part about focus groups is if you see a common problem that you can't change. Like there's a resource issue with it. Like you can't recast the voice actor. Like people don't like a certain element, but you don't have the time to change it or fix it. That's the most frustrating part because you want to fix everything and you want to make it good,
Right.
but you just can't, and that's the worst part. But again, like having that knowledge as quickly as possible. We staged a lot of focus groups for the New Vegas DLCs. We try to do that as often as we had time for, and as early as we had time for, so we try and prevent those problems. But there were some components that we just couldn't change or didn't have the time to change, and that was kind of rough. So that was kind of hard to deal with.
Okay. How has gaming changed since you first got into it? When did you start? Back in '95, I think it was, with Interplay, I believe it was.
Yeah, I think I got into Interplay like 80 and 89, I think. It's been
it
so
that
long.
Oh, okay. I thought it was, okay. I thought it was a bit later than that. But then the question still stands though, as far as like video games and both tabletop gaming. How have you seen things changed? Has it gotten easier? Has it gotten harder? Like what's the landscape now as opposed to when you first started in it?
It has gotten a lot more specialized. When I first started out, like the idea of voice acting an entire game was no one would have considered doing that for an RPG. That was just ridiculous. And then having, the amount of detail in the environments, like I don't think anyone could have imagined how far that would go. And so basically your workload has increased, but the narrowness, your role has gotten kind of narrow. Like, when I first started out, like there were some companies that didn't have designers. Like Blizzard didn't have a position that was a designer. Like they didn't see any value in that position. And usually a lot of programmers are the designers for games, which is fine. Then, over the years, suddenly there was a designer role. And then suddenly that role broke down to, well, you're not just a designer. Like, are you assistant designer? Are you a level designer? Like, are you an interface designer? Are you, a creative designer? You do a lot of writing. Like, the roles just started branching and branching. But the type of work you did suddenly got narrower and narrower, where, I might not be involved with systems at all, or, I might have only a little impact on level design when previously it would have been a much larger part of my role. So that's one thing that's changed. And then the actual process for writing hasn't changed too much. And actually the presentation of the writing beyond voice acting, I don't feel has really, gone through leaps and bounds. I think VR is probably going to change a lot of that, just because it can read your gestures and where you're looking and track all that and respond to it. But I think when it comes to actual like console or PC, writing and presentation, that really hasn't changed a whole lot, except it's gotten a lot more expensive.
Okay. Well, you just actually gave me a tasty little nugget that I'd be remiss not to mention. You mentioned that VR is going to change things because it actually can see your emotions and, or not emotions, but your movements and things like that, and can kind of read you. Is this something that you might be working on currently, perhaps in an upcoming project, maybe?
Yeah, actually, I worked on one VR adventure style game last year, and they ran me through all the scripting conditionals that could be checked for any particular conversation, and things like, do you shake somebody's hand when it's offered, like, or do you yank your hand back, like, do you not look at the person directly, do you not make eye contact, like all of those things, or even how you use items in the environment, like, hey, you take like a laser pointer pen and you point at someone's eye, like all of those things will cause reactions in those people that create interactions. But it's not just solely dialogue. There's a lot more gestures and body language involved, which adds a real rich layer to any conversation, because that's but it's not talking heads anymore. Suddenly, you're more immersed in that world and immersed in that conversation, and suddenly you're very conscious of everything that you're doing. But these are things that we've just sort of come to instinctually recognize when having a conversation with somebody. But then in VR, like, it's kind of refreshing to suddenly be aware of all those things again, and then see the game and the game world react to those things is very cool.
How's the tabletop gaming changed since you first started working on it then?
Oh, well, I confess I don't have time to do a lot of tabletop gaming. I did play a little bit of Pathfinder recently, and then because we used to have like lunch games, and also we played in a Greyhawk campaign also during lunch games. But the things I've noticed about tabletop gaming is it's much easier to get a group together via remote. Like, there's all sorts of tools and utilities to help people in different, states or parts of the world actually get together for a game. And that's kind of cool to see, because I know one of the big challenges is when, all your friends scatter to the winds, it's hard to get together for a game anymore. So having those tools at your disposal, and, maps that can show up on people's, like, screen shares and displays, like all that stuff is very cool for bringing a gaming group together, even when you're not in the same room. So that's kind of cool to see.
The group that I play with, me and the GM are also in California, but everyone else is all over the country, and we use what's called we use Roll20, and that's how we're able to like play D&D on the internet. So my next question, and this is a bit of I guess a personal philosophical one. What do you consider yourself to be more? So if you had to put this on your business card, would you have it say Chris Avellone game designer or Chris Avellone games player? I mean, not necessarily business card. No one would put games player on their business card. But what do you consider yourself to be more?
Oh, game designer. Yeah, I think I'm more recognized for game writing, but I think game writing is a different kind of game. It's just that with writing, I think there's a number of approaches you can do to game writing, and if you're just doing exposition, or if you're just doing something the player passively listens to, that's obviously not a game. It's just giving you information. But if you actually turn dialogues and interactions into systems, and worked in espionage. I worked in an espionage RPG called Alpha Protocol, which did sort of dialogue system for which the designers to be commended. That becomes much more of a game, or things that affect your alignment, or affect faction standing, or you're able to use skills in dialogues, or find ways to explore dialogues like you would a dungeon. Suddenly, those interactions become something more than exposition, and the player is more a part of it, and that's much more of a game to me rather than just writing.
So just by the fact that you do more designing than playing, you just feel more you're a designer. Okay. You said in an interview that you didn't feel you were growing as a designer, and that you're freelance. You feel like you've opened yourself up and you're growing more. Have you gained any insights that you think you can share that you didn't have previously as a result of going freelance and growing, as you said?
Yeah, actually, there's a few things. So some of it is pretty pragmatic. I think a lot of the tasking software and the issue tracking that other companies use is far superior to what I've used in the past. The ways they're able to collaborate, even with something as seemingly basic as everyone having access to a Google Drive, like it's the easiest thing in the world, but the way it really speeds up your collaboration and the way, allows people to simultaneously review and work on documents, get all that stuff really makes things just get finalized faster. Like I didn't realize how many roadblocks were sort of part of the older procedures I was using. So that's one thing. Like anywhere from communication tools to how you organize your documents, and whatever what the tracking software you use. Also, being exposed to a variety of different game editors and seeing how content is implemented across different games. That's been really eye-opening in terms of what works, or what things you probably wouldn't take with you when you were designing an editor on your own. And also the range of other writers you meet, I think, is important. I've always been able to work with other writers at previous companies, but now it's like I've been able to work with anywhere from 25 to 30 other different writers, over the span of, each year. And then you learn their techniques and how they approach stuff. And you'll learn something, at least one thing, if not, a bunch of stuff from each one, where you're like, oh, wow, that's a much better way to approach that. Or, oh, that's a much better way of conveying that situation. Or, oh, I wouldn't have thought of conveying that story element that way. Or, or designing it with, art that way. Like all these things just suddenly become part of your library. And I didn't really realize exactly how small my library was until I sort of got out in the world. I'm like, wow, there are many, many, many other ways to do this. There's other ways that genres outside of role-playing games have great ways to tell stories that role-playing games would benefit from, and vice versa. And now I can share those things, and they can share the same things with me, and then I can learn how to do it on those projects. Like, I learned a lot from working on Prey. I also learned a lot, working on Divinity, the System Shock reboot, like all these things. Just it's really shaken up my design process in a good way, and I'm really grateful for that.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Prey, because that actually brings us right into the next section. I was going to ask you some stuff about Star Wars, but you've basically answered all of it, so it's like, yeah, we can just skip that section now. That's fine. But yeah, definitely Prey. So that's the latest game you've worked on. I guess the obvious question for me anyway, and maybe for a lot of folks who haven't played it yet, because I've only played the little demo section, and I didn't really get a strong understanding about the game other than kind of the game mechanics and how things work more than anything else. Is there any kind of connection narratively consistent between the first game and the one that just came out recently?
The latest Prey takes place in an entirely different universe, different timeline. It doesn't have any connection to the previous Prey games. No.
Oh, okay. How'd you end up working on Prey? Like, was it just kind of like they needed somebody with that kind of experience that you have as far as like the very large narrative branching type stuff, or was this something you went after? You're like, oh, they're making a new Prey game.
Well, it was actually really flattering. The studio director of Arcane in Austin, Raphael, he just dropped me a line one day and said, "Hey, I really like your work. Would you ever be interested in writing for us?" And at the time, I couldn't accept, but then later on, I could. So I wrote back to him and I'm like, hey, is that offer still open? Because I'd be very interested in working with you. And he said within a week, it was all good to go. I was able to go down to Austin, see their layouts for the game, see their proposed cast list for, each character and what they'd be doing in the environment, like the layout of the Talos One station, how the story would progress and who the enemies, like all this stuff was just very well laid out. It was very succinct. I was very impressed. And I'm like, okay, well, that sounds great. And they're like, well, I think the first thing to do, is play the game for a while, and we'll watch you, which was fun because I felt like I was, one of the focus testers. And then they're like, well, let's start off by, helping us like tackle the supporting cast for this game, because the lead writer and lead designer Ricardo Bear, he was handling all the primary characters for the critical path, but he knew that there'd be a lot of side quest element stuff too, and he wanted to make sure all the characters got equal attention, but he knew that he didn't have the time to do everything. So I got one side character, then another, and then I helped out with lore and the history, and then the role kept expanding, and then by the end of it, I'm like, wow, I've written a good chunk of characters for the game, and I'm really happy with them, and then I'm like, God, I hope the game does well. So it seems to be doing pretty great. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what's the reception been like so far?
Yeah, it's been pretty positive. The 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 idea that I think it was maybe there was a slight challenge in exactly how to sell the game, because like what you're mentioning with the initial hour, it's sometimes it was hard for some reviewers, I think, to know what type of game it was, and then but I think the ones that experienced it and played it, they got it and they enjoyed it. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with the demo, I mean, it basically does what it needs to do. It gives you a little taste of the story, but it gives you mechanically an idea of how the game is going to work and how you're going to interact with enemies and stuff. So I thought it was successful on that, on that front. It definitely has me wanting to check it out more. I definitely have an interest level that wasn't there before, quite honestly. So yeah, no, I'm looking forward to playing it at some point. Absolutely. So I think the demo was effective in that regard for sure. So
well, good.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess this kind of leads into another question. Do you pay, like, as far as like when a game gets released, do you pay attention much to the reviews that come out, or do you just kind of like, no thanks, I did my job, I don't need to hear about anything else?
You sort of have to if the reason I say have to is because to be a good game developer, you have to expose yourself and actively go out and see what the critiques of your work are. Because if you do sort of shy away from it, you might make that same mistake again. And you want to know what people responded to, like what sort of things did they like, what things worked well, and those things could be things you never expected. And in which case that gets added to your library. We're like, hey, wait a minute. When I was doing this game, I did learn that doing less companions ends up being better than constantly adding more and more with each game. Like it's the quality of them that people care about, not the number. Right. Any of the critique is bad, it's good to know like what the issue is. Like, because there are some things you can fix with a patch. A certain weapon's overbalanced, or a certain weapon's not balanced, or there's a certain level people find problematic. Well, all those things you can still address some of them, and then for other elements, there are things to just keep in mind if you do a sequel or another game where you're like, okay, well now we've learned our lesson with that. Let's make sure that we don't do that again when doing this certain genre. So reviews and the forums, I think, are really important for getting critiques that makes your development skills stronger. So I do try and review those, and even for people who are really upset or really angry, you just gotta swallow it and then try and figure out. You sort of drill down and pass the profanity and the bile and figure out, okay, why is this person upset? Like, right. Why were they not having a good time? Is there a valid reason for it, and is there a way to fix it? And I think that's important to do too.
Right on. I'm actually kind of, I don't want to say that was a setup question, because that's not what I meant by it, but I'm really glad you answered it in the way you did, because I think I've seen other creators or people that have worked on games say, I don't pay attention to any of that stuff, and personally I think that's one of the most important things about being a creator when you're making things, is to be able to get that kind of feedback and to hear from people and to see what, like you said, what does work and what doesn't, and if there's issues and things that you can actually address. So yeah, I'm actually pretty stoked that you said it a lot more better. Excuse me. I'm glad.
Yes, Scott, he said it a lot more better.
He just said it a lot more better than I would have, obviously. No, I appreciate your answer, though, because like I said, sometimes you'll see people and they'll be like, nah, I don't pay attention to that stuff.
Yeah, and, I mean, yeah. Some artists feel like once they're done with it, they're done. They don't want to go back and experience it again. But in your case, Chris, you feel it's an iterative process, and you want to keep building on it and learning from it.
Yeah, and also I think there's also some developers where they won't play the game they're working on, and sometimes certain departments, like that's just as an example, like sometimes maybe like an art department won't play the game they're working on, but it's so important because even before the game is released, like you need to be criticizing your own work, and also it's not just the art you're making, but you have to see how your art's being used in the environment. Like, is it being positioned correctly? Like, is it actually pulling off the effect that you intended when you first modeled the object or the character? Like, is it being used the way you thought it would? And if not, is there a way to improve it or fix it? But it's almost like a super vigilant process. Like, when you create something, like that's almost just the first step to, okay, well now I have to critique, edit, review it until like it's at the level that, I imagined it would be, because you can't really just fire and forget and hope it all works out. That's not usually gonna yield very good results.
So you're saying it's somewhat like raising a child to a certain degree. You can't just
Yeah.
poop out the child and then put it out in the thing and then just go live long and prosper. Yes, no, that doesn't work.
Can't take your eyes off them for a moment.
Well, I think that's a good note to wrap on. You wanna bring this home, Scott?
Yeah, Chris, thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate your time and your insight, because part of why we do this is to find out the working process and the things that the people that are involved in making games and the comics and the things we actually love and care about, what they think about these kind of things and how it might help other people. So thank you very much for sharing. We really, really appreciate you stopping by and spending the time with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. I had a lot of fun.
And if you ever want to come back and talk about just, stuff that you're enjoying and not necessarily just you, please do.
Yeah.
Because then we
I
can
would
just,
love
I don't, yeah.
Yes,
I'd love that. That'd be great.
There's an open invitation. If you ever want to come just hang out and talk shit, you're more than welcome to do so.
I don't think Chris will talk shit. I think
well, you know what I mean.
But maybe you and I can talk Scott into liking D&D, because Scott's not D&D.
Well, no. To be fair, it's not that I don't like it. It's my experiences when I was growing up, because Chris and I have very similar experiences growing up at the same time when being a geek was not a very popular thing, and I had friends who were really into it, and they tried wrangling me into it. And my first experience is just kind of like, I was just kind of bored because the GM was just not very exciting. He wasn't really.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't really doing
it's
much.
It's the GM's fault. All right,
yes,
Scott.
It wasn't my fault.
Like I haven't heard that before.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, again, Chris, thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate it, and congratulations on the new game, and great success going forward with you, sir. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys very much.
Thanks for stopping by. If you enjoyed this episode of Entertaining Guests, please like, subscribe, and share links to our show on places like Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media sites you enjoy. Every week, Big and Robot strives to bring you entertaining and insightful content which can be enjoyed on a variety of platforms. From SoundCloud to iTunes, vid.me to YouTube, there are many different ways to connect with our content. If you enjoy our content and would like to support Big and Robot, consider becoming a patron on patreon.com. You'll find links to our Patreon page in the description below. Have a question, comment, or business inquiry? Check below for links to our social media accounts as well as our email address where you can contact us directly. Thanks again for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.